Today, we are having, as I said, two speakers. We have Marjory Blumenthal, who is at the International Computer Science Institute at the University of California, Berkeley. And we have Merve Hickok, who's at the University of Michigan School of Information, and is also the president of the Center for AI and Digital Policy and founder of AIethicist.org. Just want to, before we launch into their discussion, tell you that the next event in this series will be on the 31st of August. And that's going to be looking under the hood of generative AI. So today's topic is the generative AI ethics. And in this arena, there are lots of questions that one could ask. As a way just to kick off the discussion, I'd like to ask Merve and Marjory to just talk to us about what are the major questions to think about in the context of generative AI. What are the ethical problems that one should worry about? And we'll get into a lot of detail, I'm sure, as we go through.
Marjory, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I think there's some foundational issues when we think about generative AI or even other aspects of AI in the research context. And they begin with disparate aspects to computational resources. The entities that contribute to this series are comparatively well endowed with computational capacity, know-how, and so on. But I think it's important for us to remember that that's not true of all research institutions in this country or around the world. And that matters because it affects who does the research and to some extent, what research actually gets done. The second broad comment I'd make is that it's important to understand data provenance. And a lot of times people talk about data in a very loose way. We've read a lot about web scraping that's done, but even if you say web scraping is where the data came from, well, it really came from some other places before it got to wherever it could have been scraped. And then there are questions about the appropriateness of the access and the scope and so on. There are many things that I could say, but I think for the purpose of getting our conversation started, I will end with this one, which is that when people talk about the data aspects and what is ethical in terms of data, there's a set of principles that people often refer to, the FAIR principles of findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And my observation is that those are goals that are honored more in the brief than in implementation. And so we have some real practical challenges of being ethical in the conduct of research. And again, I could say more. I'm going to leave it at that so Merve can weigh in.
Thank you so much, and I'll continue from your comments, especially in terms of data provenance and the opaqueness of that data as well. As you mentioned, only a handful of companies or organizations or labs have access to the resources that are required, whether it's the money, the compute resources, hosting resources, or the talent itself. So they decide what to disclose in terms of the dataset provenance, but also dataset quality, as well as the models and purpose fit. So as a researcher coming in, you are really working in an opaque environment. and you cannot be really sure how much bias, because it's not about if there is bias, it's really at this point how much bias there is in the data set, and how much underrepresentation or stereotyping is also embedded in the systems. So what does that mean for your research or the smaller models that you build upon these? Similarly, because we don't know the provenance or the quality of data, you might, for intents and purposes, be plagiarizing or infringing on copyrights or protected material. Protected in the terms of like traits, protected material information protections, but also private information of the individuals, private personally identifiable information, information that they didn't want to be made public, but somehow it got scraped because some of these bots were also able to go behind the paywalls. And also, as researchers, as you're interacting with the systems, you end up prompting the system with certain elements of your research and have to upload certain material. The default of many of these systems is whatever you upload becomes part of the product itself. So if you're not intentionally opting out, you are also contributing to that training, and your ideas, original ideas, private information within your data set, within your research that you have committed to protecting might also become part of that that product. And I think further down we can talk about accuracy or reproducibility or continuity issues as well, but I'll leave it at that for the moment.
So let me just underscore one thing you said, this quid pro quo aspect, I think is very, very important, like a kind of pay to play. You put in your stuff so that you can get the benefit. And I'm guessing that a lot of people don't think that through fully, which could affect any kind of researcher, but might also have some particular implications for people doing research that could bleed into a dual use area of concern, which does not apply to a lot of research, but does apply to some.
So actually, I'd like to just do a small follow-up question in terms of this reciprocity and ownership type of thing. If one considers pre-generative AI and user opinion sharing sites, something like Yelp, the way most people, I think about this is as sort of part of a public good. I'll post reviews of businesses that I went to because I like to read reviews about businesses that I'm considering going to. And the fact that somebody happens to provide a platform and make money is almost secondary. In what way do you see the thinking or the framing of the problem to be? Firstly, do you see that as an issue already? And secondly, if not, in what way is the framing different when we get into generative AI?
So if I could just give a couple quick comments. So when you started laying out your question, I thought about open source, and there is a kind of reciprocity in that environment, and it's applied in many contexts. But to pivot over to Merve, I would wonder about differences between the research context and the giving of reviews and other kinds of content in a social media environment, because researchers live and die by their intellectual property. They're expected to publish, they're expected to make novel contributions. And so there's often a concern about being scooped.
And I think when you're providing content, no, when you're providing responses or information in different forums or reviews, etc., you're doing it in that context. That is very context dependent. So scraping makes consent as assumed. Just you put it in the public, so it's fair game. However, we need to be thinking about in which context that consent was given as well, and in which context that information was provided in the first place. Just because it's in the public realm, it shouldn't be, just scrape it all. But also with generative AI systems, we have seen, and I believe this is one of the reasons that the data sets are becoming so opaque, because the companies do not want to be opening themselves up for further liability with all the copyrighted and protected trademark information that they have already scraped, going beyond what was in the public realm.
Thank you. So I'd like to follow up actually on a different aspect of what you said very briefly, Merve, about reproducibility. How do you see the use of generative AI in research affecting the rigor of the research methods and the reproducibility of the results?
Well, in terms of the rigor, as we both mentioned, the data sets and the models are opaque, right? So you are significant part of your data, or significant part of your data work, as well as some of the models are conducted in the dark. And you are really dependent on the company's decision to, for example, continue or discontinue a particular model that you might have built your research on. So when, for example, OpenAI or Meta or any other organization who are providing this right now, say this particular subset or submodel or sub-data set will be discontinued at such and such date, you might have actually, as a researcher or even as a product developer, might have spent additional research, have spent a lot of resources to build that, but now the company has decided that it's going to discontinue, and you might need to spend additional resources to migrate that model. Or if you don't have those researchers, your research will no longer be supported or will be reproducible, because you need those same parameters and same settings for that. And then I would say, and just before passing to Marjory, you are taking additional liability and responsibility as the downstream user of this system. So not only it's impacting the rigor and reproducibility, but you as the researcher are taking on, like I said, whatever bias or infringements, etc., are embedded already in the systems. You become part of that ecosystem as well.
So I would follow up by pulling back a little to think broadly about the contributions of AI to research. I had the good fortune to participate in an inquiry led by the OECD over the last year, which was very systematic and global in looking at what did AI mean for research. And they emphasized how much potential, not that we can realize all that potential right now, but whether it's so-called robot scientists, that is systems that can collect massive amounts of facts, extract data from massive amounts of literature, generate and test hypotheses in parallel. There are lots of tools that are coming out of AI, some of which might engage generative AI or may engage simpler systems. So there is a lot of of potential. I agree with Merve that there are things that are unknown with opacity, and there are some real questions about what kind of testing has been done to explore and assess the limitations. One of the kinds of research I've been working on in the last couple of years is a different kind of application of AI. It's development of automated vehicles. And what people have seen there is, you know, there's only so far that you can go with simulation. You have to get the vehicle out on the road. And I don't know what the analogy is for, you know, lab-based research, but there may be some other analogy that involves different kinds of testing. On the negative side, you know, we've all heard about the hallucinations from some of the large language model systems. And then more recently, there has been news about deterioration of capabilities in basic math, which I think are particularly alarming because, again, if we think about an AI system being used as a tool, you want to assume that the basics can be relied upon. And if they can't, that opens a lot of questions. The other comment I would throw on the table for now before handing back to the two of you is that research takes place in a system with different kinds of oversight actors. You know, there are the research integrity mechanisms within a university. There are the aspects of journal publishing. There are professional societies generally. There are funders who can have requirements, and we may touch on that later when it comes to the government. So I think there are some interesting questions about what these oversight providers might do to either raise the floor or otherwise address concerns about rigor, if not reproducibility, which is its own can of worms.
Merve, do you have any follow-up on that, or?
Just one thing, and this might be a more like further down the line as the systems become more even more adapted. But at some point, we're going to see the synthetic data fed back into the internet. So, right, I mean, as the products were initially developed, is scraping of whatever data was in the internet, or majority of it, let's say. However, there will be, we now see just automated news platforms or digital books, all created, a lot of content already being created by generative AI systems that are pushed back to the internet. So I think there will be a threshold point where the synthetic data or generated data overwhelms the maybe call it natural data, natural content. And it'll be interesting to see what that means then for the future accuracy, inaccuracy, or capabilities of these systems as well.
So just as an aside, and I hadn't thought about this in advance, I know that there has been an effort within the federal government to think about how R&D can be helpful in the context of what the federal group has called information integrity. I don't particularly like that term in this context, but they were thinking about the proliferating generation of misinformation and disinformation. And that's a cousin of what you're talking about in terms of implications for research. So even though when I read the research plan that this group put out, I thought it was very optimistic about what could be accomplished. Nevertheless, they hold out the hope that while these perils will grow, that we will have counter mechanisms being developed. And we just don't know how that is going to sort out. But in other words, it's not as if the synthetic material that you rightly described will necessarily proliferate, unchecked, and without any way to deal with it. It just, they still may do more, they may do a better job at generating the bad stuff, but we might get better at figuring out how to cope with it.
So I wanted to actually mention a slightly different and much narrower point about repeatability, which is a very low bar requirement if one is going to have reproducible work. When one uses randomness in software, for instance, or a simulation, it's controlled randomness. There is a particular seed that one uses, and by using the same seed, you can get exactly the same set of random numbers generated, and therefore repeat the exact same computation if you needed to show that. To my knowledge, at the current time, there is no such control available to manage the randomness of generative AI systems. They require randomness to be creative. And without, I believe this is a technical problem. I don't know how easy it is to solve. And until it is solved and users have the ability to get repeatability, I think that anything that happens is a one-time thing, which makes it very hard to use for any scientific purpose.
And the weights themselves are also opaque. So without knowing when those weights are changing, if they are changing, how much they are changing, you're losing yet another set of specifications to be able to repeat and reproduce.
So one of the things that I didn't say earlier that I thought about was that, with these learning systems, tomorrow is not like today, which is not like yesterday. But I also have a kind of buck passing response to this very real concern. And that is that NIST has been asked to step in and do its thing, which is to focus on measurements, metrology, evaluation approaches, and so on. So I think the research community should work with NIST because it has a broad convening role. It doesn't necessarily do only its own thing, to figure out how to address the concerns that have been raised. Even if we don't have any path to seeing an answer today, that is on their plate based on things that the federal government has been doing over the last couple of years to set up a broader AI-focused R&D enterprise.
So that's probably a good point to segue to the next segment of this, which is talking about regulation and policy issues. But I have a quick announcement to all of our listeners. I saw a couple of raised hands. The way this webinar is being run, please post your questions using the Q&A button that you see on your screen. And I will ask the question for you and we'll address them. I'm afraid I won't be able to recognize your raised hand. So moving on to policy issues and legislative considerations, let's just focus on the United States first. And if you could tell us some of the issues that one should keep in mind as one tries to understand the landscape. Marjory, do you want to go first?
Sure. First of all, whether it's this domain or any other, it's always important to think about ends versus means and what we don't know about each. And I say that in part because in the last couple of years, there's been a scramble to say, oh my God, there's a problem. We need to regulate. We need to have new entities to do this. And by the way, you know, we're seeing some of those activities elsewhere. I would urge more thoughtful reflection, first of all, on what we can do using existing mechanisms and the flexibility of existing authorities. That's certainly the easiest way forward. But Pam Samuelson at Berkeley, she's a lawyer, has been rather eloquent in discussing how copyright and other aspects of intellectual property law already work in many respects and are perhaps the most immediately applicable policy framework for AI, including generative AI. That doesn't mean it's sufficient, but it is a step forward. You know, on the other extreme, the National AI Advisory Committee, in its first report, it said, well, there are different entities, but we need to have a new White House entity to deal with AI. And I have to say, I had a very negative reaction to that recommendation, in part because creating another bureaucracy in general is problematic. Creating something within the White House is particularly fraught because administrations change, and the reality is the White House is intrinsically politicized. If I pull back again, I know that people have proposed new entities for information technology generally, policy covering information technology generally, and of course, everyone uses IT across domains covered by all agencies. We've had proposals for a new cybersecurity entity. We've had proposals for a new privacy entity. None of these have panned out. You know, one consequence is that people try to load a lot onto the Federal Trade Commission. That's a whole other conversation. But I think it's important to recognize that we are hamstrung by a kind of information asymmetry. The private developers, private sector developers of these technologies will always know more than the government people who are ostensibly responsible for dealing with them. And the problems of regulatory capture will be as real with a new entity as anywhere else. So more things that I could say. I will leave it at that and circle back after Merve has had a chance to weigh in.
Thank you. And just to continue on what you were mentioning, I'll flip it around a bit and say legislative versus non-legislative conversations and policy conversations. And I have to admit that I've been involved with Center for AI and Digital Policy and AI policy work and DC conversations for a long time, asking for regulation on AI. There has been a significant shift in the last 9 months with the generative AI systems being rolled out or launched and becoming commercial products, for good or bad. I think that we can discuss that at a different stage. We've been asking for regulation of current AI systems as well as generative AI systems since they came out, but a lot of the focus right now is how do we control generative AI? So setting that aside, there is a flurry of activity both on the executive branch, the legislative branch, as well as the regulatory agencies. Marjory, you mentioned a lot of conversations on whether the oversight and enforcement should fall under existing regulatory agencies like Federal Trade Commission, SEC on the financial on the finance side, FCC, FEC, and a whole flurry of acronym agencies, or whether there should be a central agency like a licensing agency or oversight agency that may do licensing or may just act as like a central coordinating agency across different federal agencies. Within some of the congressional hearings, there's been discussions of whether generative AI systems should fall under Section 230 and benefit from the protections of 230, but the response from that, from both the congressional representatives, elected representatives, and a lot of the civil society was, no, we've made mistakes with 230. It was great, it works great, but there's still development for Section 230. Let's not put this generative AI systems in the same bucket. So I think there's now somehow a settled issue that 230 doesn't apply. There's definitely a lot of conversations on copyright regulations, as you mentioned, and what fair use means, whether the current definition of fair use stands or not, as well as current definitions of liability also apply or not. We've seen that several federal agencies coming out and saying, doesn't matter, AI, generative AI, or whatever, we have enforcement powers and we'll investigate and enforce. I think time will show what, I think they will, but time will show what that looks like. On the non-legislative side, so there's a lot of the conversation in the Congress, but on the non-legislative side, we see a lot of policy initiatives from the White House, whether it's meetings with the industry leaders and getting them to commit to certain voluntary conduct, or asking them to report incidents, or whether it is kind of separate bucket of court cases. There are now several court cases, mostly focused on copyright infringements, and I think one libel one, that are going through the court system, justice system. So their outcomes will also set precedents of how AI, generative AI, is regulated in the US.
Let me follow up just on a couple of things. You had made a reference to licensing regimes, and it's worth noting, without at least conclusion at my end, that there has been a discussion for decades about whether software engineers, extending that to the people who develop these AI systems, should be licensed like other kinds of engineers. And those discussions have foundered. And we're now in a moment in time where people can think about more and more people developing software, think about all the proliferating coding camps, everybody should code, et cetera. And we now have AI tools to help you. So the question of who is developing this stuff, what do we know about them, can we raise the floor under them? Those are real questions, and I don't expect we're going to be able to answer them anytime soon, but I will acknowledge the questions are real. On liability, leaving aside the intellectual property side, I'll again go back to my automated vehicle work, where people are working on liability, and there's a general expectation that as you move from a context in which a human is obviously responsible, a driver, to one where a system is, then the developer or operator of the system is expected to be liable. And how that plays out in this context remains to be seen, but I would expect that people and companies are beginning to think this through. And certainly some of the larger platform providers also are involved in ventures like automated driving, and are seeing this in other parts of the house. And then the last comment I would make about existing regimes is, the Food and Drug Administration has dealt with digitization of medical devices since at least the 90s. And so, fast forwarding, they have ways to think about AI. Transportation and all the different modes, they're going to think about AI, generative or other, in their context. Agriculture, you name it, the different domains in their worlds have mechanisms. And if those mechanisms don't work for these new tools, then there's going to be an effort to update those mechanisms. And it's partly that diversified, context-dependent view of the world that gives me some comfort that even without a centralized entity, it's not as if nothing will happen.
So I'd like to ask you to consider a different aspect of regulation. Whenever one has to regulate something, there are good things that are supposed to happen, and there are bad things that you're supposed to try to prevent. So how do you weigh benefits against harms in the specific context of generative AI? And particularly given that the benefits and harms may not accrue to the same people. I suppose this is a problem that occurs with respect to regulation in almost any arena, and is resolved through a political process. But it would still be helpful if you could lay out some of the key considerations in the context of generative AI.
Yeah, and I can go first, and I think this is a slightly rephrased version of does regulation impede innovation, which I am strongly against. I mean, our position is no regulation, and makes innovation more creative, more safe, and better for everyone. And you mentioned the harms accrue in different ways. Harms and benefits accrue in different ways for different parts of the population. So regulation also tries to narrow that gap and make it more equitable. Some of my engineering friends, sometimes I kind of tease them saying, yeah, you just want the easy route. You don't want to think about the constraints that the regulation enforces that might kind of slow down your product development phase or model development phase. But at the end of the day, we are all better for it. Your product is better for it. You are better for it. And everyone being impacted by that is better for it. We have seen those balance. I don't want to say balancing act, because balancing is yet another term that I would like to avoid. But we have seen regulation significantly improve these products, as you mentioned, and pharmaceutical industry, and automotive, aviation, transportation at large, energy management, critical infrastructure, etc. So I think it definitely forces you to think further and invest a bit further in your products and services, but I don't think it impedes innovation in that sense, because innovation at the end of the day needs to serve everyone equitably.
So first, Merve gave some examples that speak to how, when it comes to life, health, safety, that kind of risk, I think almost everyone agrees needs a lot of attention. We have trouble sometimes understanding what is the real risk in a context. If you look at social media, I signed on to LinkedIn earlier this week. I got an offer of AI helping me to improve my posts. But if I think about social media generally, we know that the algorithms, which I don't have a chance to influence, might affect how much mis or disinformation I see, or just whatever I see. So even social media doesn't necessarily fall neatly into a less worryable versus more worrying context. But I would note that even in the life, health, safety basket, there is an expectation of some irreducible minimum of risk, some residual risk. Again, if you look at the NIST risk management framework, they acknowledge that that exists. And as with NIST cybersecurity risk management approach, there is a big difference between managing risks and preventing or completely avoiding them. So if I go back to my automated vehicle example, engineers will tell you the safest vehicle is the one that never leaves its parking space. And so, as long as you want to get some benefit, one may not like balancing, trade-off, whatever, but we're in that zone where there is risk. I will note on the point with innovation that I've had a series of occasional interactions with people from Europe over the last couple of years, mostly on automated vehicles, somewhat on cybersecurity. And I've been struck by how in these contexts, European government officials have acknowledged that they are great at regulations, and they don't feel that they are experiencing the same level of innovation as what they see coming out of the US. These things aren't necessarily said publicly, although at a major automated vehicle conference last month in San Francisco, they were said publicly because people could ride in automated vehicles around San Francisco. Not that they don't have problems, and they do, but it was really a live example, not Gen AI, but an application of AI where people are literally seeing, sitting in, experiencing, and thinking really hard about this balancing. So the last thing I would say is, it would be helpful, and again, NIST may be the one charged with doing this in the United States, to develop a more granular way of evaluating what the risks are and what the trade-offs are. If you allow X amount of risk, can you say you'll get Y amount of benefit? Do we have a way of thinking about that? There are domains in transportation and in health where people have done that kind of calculation. I think with Gen AI, the technologies are so dynamic that we're not in a position to do that kind of analysis yet, and that makes it harder to have a conversation.
Merve, did you have anything to add to that?
No, but I think just thinking of the policy and regulations from a wider context, and this might not be relevant to the academic research community that is on the call here, but we have these conversations a lot with lawmakers of what kind of actions and capabilities and capacity generative AI systems can allow for asymmetrical actors. Because you can, when you're building these controls in place, you need to also think of those who are not going to be feel like they're regulated, or feel the urge to comply with regulations. So, for example, you might have national militaries. You might you have certain international conventions that every country has committed to follow. So there are limits to what you can do. Similar with companies, there are things that you're regulated, you need to comply with certain controls, and if you don't, there are going to be penalties or fines or certain consequences. Asymmetrical actors do not care about that, but actors with malicious intentions, I should say. So whether you are weaponizing a drone, attacking a critical infrastructure, or building GPT systems like Worm GPT or QChain for GPT, they don't necessarily think of being bound by regulation, obviously. So you need to also think of how through regulation, how through policy, how through certain even export controls to a certain extent, how do you manage and kind of narrow that scope, narrow that threat surface as well. So there, again, maybe not for academic research purposes, but there are additional considerations when it comes to policy and regulations.
So I think Merve is absolutely right on that. And I think where it will hit academic research is probably going to be in those areas where technologies or certain applications are more obviously dual use, or when people can think about that. And we've been seeing this generally with biotechnology, for example, and that is just one of another, one of the many domains where people are applying AI when they hadn't before. So absolutely, responsible AI is meaningful only when the people are responsible.
Right. So I also wanted to ask you to comment a little bit about how things like red teaming to find problems or the complement of that incident reporting should work in the context of generative AI. That would be one of the tools in the toolbox for regulation, I suppose.
As you mentioned, it is one of the many tools or one of the many things that you can do on this governance spectrum. So they cannot stand by themselves, but what they allow for is, for example, red teaming and the great initiative in DEFCON a couple of weeks ago, allow more people to understand, one, how this works, how can, as for example, a cybersecurity tool can be repurposed for generative AI safety or security. How can we get more people involved in this? Because with red teaming, one of the things that is crucial is domain knowledge, subject matter expertise. So you might be coming in, for example, as a someone who is knowledgeable in chemistry or biology, and kind of prompt the system to create malicious, creates outputs that can help with malicious intent, such as bioweapons or viruses or different chemical combinations. You can come at it from a totally different perspective as an educator, and kind of prompt the system as like what might some students might ask this, or what might be some of the negative implications in an education context. You can come through to it from for example, a racial or religious content, perspective, and say, prompted with different religious perspectives, and see if the responses are more biased or stereotyped against certain religions, etc. So there isn't like one red teaming checklist says, okay, check this. It is really dependent on the amount of subject matter expertise that goes into it, what do you do with the feedback that your red team provide with you, and how do you ensure that you're solving the problem and not patching it? It's like, because a lot of these problems tend to be a function of the system, not glitches or not bugs. So I would put red team in there, but it is definitely a great tool within the spectrum. Similarly, I have more trust and not more trust, but I have a lot of expectations from incident reporting. That is a rather new approach endorsed by both OECD here in the US and in G7 and G20 conversations. I think it will make a huge difference how you put those incident reports or incident databases together, and whether you have meaningful quality and meaningful information that you can action upon, that other people, other developers, policymakers, researchers, etc., can actually build upon or build defenses according to those incidents.
So I would add that I agree that red teaming is just one tool in the toolbox, and one might compare it to things like bug bounties and challenges that get people to help in the stress testing of a system in a structured way. I also agree that incident reporting can be particularly useful, especially if incidents are shared fully enough, that is both broadly but also in their details. At least in transportation, the canonical example is what happens in aviation, where there is a sort of no-fault anonymous potential to report incidents, as well as the incidents that are documented based on a bad thing having happened, and then you get a kind of national investigation. But in thinking about incidents, it's worth asking, what is the scope of incidents that might be covered? How do you define an incident? What kinds of data would you like to be reported? It might be quantitative, it might be qualitative. When it comes to motor vehicles, there are those equivalents of black boxes that most vehicles have, but they only cover data a few seconds before a crash. And generally speaking, you want to know more than what's in that set of data. And you also want to think about how broadly the data can be shared. If there is a liability question, then there might be an insurance company involved. What are the channels and mechanisms for handling incidents? So, and then finally, is there a way to game the reporting of incidents, in which case you want to try to address that in some form, which may or may not be possible. But notwithstanding all of this quibbling, the idea of incident reporting is useful, and it might also itself be a basis for different kinds of research and analysis in an academic environment. I guess the last thing is to follow up on the observations that Merve had introduced in response to the last question. If the bad guys don't report, they may be happy to have these incidents with their systems. So you want to get more eyes on the problem and more potential reporters of incidents.
You're on mute.
Thank you. We have a question from an attendee saying there's a big difference between Gen AI and autonomous driving, in that autonomous driving is trying to replace an existing system of humans driving. And so we understand what that should look like, and therefore we know better how to measure performance and risks. Whereas generative AI is trying to do something that you wouldn't normally, quote, hire a human to do. It is somehow doing human cognitive and creative capabilities, but it's going well beyond that in terms of what it is creating. And so how does one think about this? One possibility is to treat it like a novel drug and do an FDA-like risk assessment. How do you feel about this?
Well, let me dive in only because I made the comparisons to AV after saying I was going to look more generally at AI. But I think that a lot of the early applications that people have discussed of Gen AI are very similar to other kinds of early applications of IT. You can find a counterpart, whether it's in education, in translation, in text generation, in art generation, in the scientific examples that I mentioned early in the conversations and so on. There are a lot of applications of Gen AI that either amplify humans or do what humans do faster at a larger scale and so on. I think that future applications, and one can also refer to future applications of other kinds of AI, will become more different from what people can do. But we've seen that before with other technologies. I'm not sure we know enough to say that Gen AI is going to be so different that we need to do something radically different to cope with it. I think that is every time we see something new, it's common to worry about it, but I don't know that we're at the existential point yet.
I'm just going to move the conversation along. One of the things that I'd like to understand better is how the US approach, which is what we've been talking about for the most part in the past several minutes, compares to approach in other countries, particularly in Europe. Merve, do you want to start?
Yeah, happy to. And we've been enrolled with EU AI Act from the very beginning, so can provide some changes over time, information about changes over time as well. But I think I see two main differentiators in the policy landscape between EU and US, especially. One is the existence of privacy and data protection regulations in Europe, GDPR to be more specific. And the other is the pending EU AI Act. EU has already have been working on a legislative approach, legislative response to AI since 2018, which turned into a draft legislation, the draft introduced in 2021, and since April 21, been kind of working to amend and bring that to a conclusion. But when ChatGPT was first deployed, they were able to make use of existing legislation with GDPR and privacy and data protection regulations, and they were able to respond to the emerging challenges immediately. So with both the Council of the European Union as well as the European Parliament, as they were doing their amendments, they immediately included in the legislation. So there wasn't like, let's discuss this for 2-3 more years and come up with a separate legislation on generative AI. It was immediately incorporated, at least the initial articles were immediately incorporated into the draft. So for example, compared that to US, end of March this year, we at CAIDP filed an extensive complaint to FTC on OpenAI and requested investigation and FTC to provide some guidelines. Our NGO partners in EU, specifically European Consumer Protection Organization, used our complaint to pressure the national and EU data protection agencies demanding similar investigations. So right after that, you might have seen different countries and their data protection agencies kind of starting to look into OpenAI, generative AI systems, and then EDPB, the Data Protection Board itself, created a generative task AI force. That was in relatively quick order. In the US, like I said, we filed a complaint end of March. It took us a few more months of advocacy campaigns and the supplement complaint beginning of July, which eventually led to the FTC investigation in mid-July. So obviously understand that FTC also is trying to figure out which of its powers, enforcement and investigative powers, that it can use in such cases. But just the fact that we don't have that legislative infrastructure to the extent that EU does is kind of impacting our ability to respond as well. But I would say, like I said, the last 9 months in the US, congressional activity and executive branch activity has been extremely busy. You have the White House actively seeking safeguards for AI systems, involving in the conversations, inviting business leaders and civil society organizations, asking for bipartisan legislation to accompany their work. And we've seen actually a number of congressional hearings on the subject. I testified back in March, trying to figure out, asking the question whether we should regulate or not. Then we are now at a point where some of the US legislators are introducing different legislative acts like the Labeling Act, Deepfakes and Elections Act, Federal Coordination Task Force Act, etc. So I think even in US now, it's a question of how rather than if we should regulate, which was not the case before. But there's certainly very different perspectives from both sides of the Atlantic.
Great, thank you. So there's another question here for as a follow-up to Marjory on we'll always have new technologies is the point. And so, how's AI and the discussions on AI or data science figuring in policy conversations, and how's it sucking oxygen out of the room, I guess?
So it's interesting that you frame that by also throwing in data science, because a decade ago, after the Snowden disclosures, the Obama White House undertook the big data and privacy examination. And a lot of the things that it talked about then, what could happen if you applied sophisticated analytics to big data, have carried forward into today. There are issues that relate to privacy of data, for example, and the ability to re-identify so-called de-identified data by combining different sorts and so on. I think what we learn from the persistence, evolution, reoccurrence of problems is to try to have a little bit of humility. I think Merve is right that there is a lot of activity going on right now because some people were caught by surprise and are not sure how to deal with the broad scope of today's applications of AI. But that doesn't mean that the activity will necessarily result in getting us to a better position because of some of the difficulties of enforcing policy or designing policy that can actually work. And we've all seen legislative proposals that don't go anywhere. So I agree that the tone of the conversation is different now, but it's also easy to be cynical about government leaders who did their best to get their products out and work toward a leadership position. And now we're saying, oh my God, what have we done? I don't think that they were that unknowing. This is what business does. They try to get leadership positions, they try to make profits. And if there is a regulatory regime now, then it will benefit the people who are already in the market. Does that necessarily give us the innovative outcome that we'd all like to have? We may not get to do the science experiment and compare. So I guess to come back to the question, science and technology policy in particular has been a fraught area for decades because people are always caught by surprise. The toolbox is never what we really want. We're not omniscient. Industry always knows more than government at some level. And so, as the political scientist said, we muddle through. The policy basis evolves, but there is no easy answer. So I'm not saying we give up. I'm just asking for humility, because even if it is a matter of what do we do rather than whether, we don't have the best answers.
Thank you. I think we should move on to our next phase in terms of what we've talked about regulation. What should investment in generative AI research look like?
So here I can be a lot more positive. There's a long history of government investment in AI of all kinds. It's been productive. It's going to continue. And government investment, by its nature, can have emphases and conditions, which can include explicit attention to potential impacts or concerns. It can spotlight implications for specific populations. We've already seen that in a lot of more recent health research funding. It can have methodological encouragement, certain kinds of interdisciplinarity, continued consideration of ethics. There has been work into the U.S. National Artificial Intelligence R&D plan, support for ethical, legal, and social implications research, taking a page from the Human Genome Project. There are ways government can focus on specific kinds of use cases. Industry may focus on those that are the most lucrative, but government can look at others, and in different ways. Many of us are associated with universities, and there are mixed concerns when it comes to generative AI and education. Well, government is probably the best source of making sure that there's a broad enough examination of how Gen AI can be used in education to best effect. And I guess the last thing I would throw in is that government investment can underwrite shared infrastructure. So I go back to what I said at the outset of this conversation, how some institutions are better endowed, have more compute capability than others. Government has a history of supporting supercomputer centers and research networking and other modes of infrastructure, which can make sure that more people are able to do research that helps to develop Gen AI with a broader set of applications and perhaps fewer of the infirmities that we touched on in this conversation.
And just to add to Marjorie's points, at the top of our conversation, beginning of the conversation, we talk about only a few companies and organizations having means to develop these systems because they're so resource incentive, and they're able to act as gatekeepers. I think as we look at government investment into generative AI research, we need to figure out what some of the choke points for researchers are, and how government can kind of create accessible conditions for researchers, which breaks that dependency on these private companies. So Marjorie already put one of the great examples of investing in shared infrastructure of hosting or compute environments. The current administration has also put out a couple of recent executive orders, one demanding equitable data access and equitable data sets, the other one making sure that all the federally funded resource is open to all resources. So those make a huge difference in terms of having access to those data sets, possibly government data sets as well, but also not having to go through the pay to private companies or having to go through their approval channels for some of the research methodologies. There is a lot of approved, investment, government investment that is geared towards building research talent. So these things don't happen by themselves. You need the human talent to accompany it. And Marjorie again also mentioned the public interest or specific research areas, incentivizing those. I would add a final one. You can also incentivize, or government can also incentivize research access to commercial generative AI systems for governance purposes. So you can, whether through mandating research access, mandating independent audits, mandating research red teaming. There are a number of different possibilities and methods where you can require a corporate entity to open its data sets and models to researchers to hold it accountable and provide feedback to improve those products. So it's not always money. Sometimes those compute powers, data set and access become more important.
I would just add to what Merve said, motivated by the reference to data sets, and going back to earlier references to NIST, that government investments can help support development of benchmarks. In the supercomputer arena, there's common benchmarks, certain other kinds of software, common benchmarks, and metrics. And researchers can be involved in helping to develop those, whether through a funded research project or in some kind of alliance with whatever NIST is doing.
So as we're beginning to get to the final moments of this thing, I'd like to ask both of you, what responsibilities do big companies, tech companies have in the space? And rolled into that also, what's the responsibility of tech leaders in particular in terms of setting an example? And one of the questions from the audience, which is tied to this, is how do you win trust, user trust? So if you could address some of these threads that are all somehow interrelated.
Sure, I can go ahead if you want.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say the issue of trustworthy AI, it has been a topic for several years now, and it is one of the principles that is both in the EU, that is the foundation of EU legislation, as well as the 2020 executive order here in the US as well, because both the government and the companies understand that without trust, their products, the systems will not be adopted further by the public. They won't be able to commercialize to the extent that they want. So how do you ensure that the public has trust in the systems so that we can expand the adoption? Obviously, the systems need to provide fair and equitable results, so not biasing one population over others. Similarly, not creating significant risks, such as infringement of fundamental rights or rule of law or democratic values as we're using this system. So you're not, for example, using AI to mass surveil, or you're not using AI for predictive policing service purposes or similar systems. So when the population, whether consumers or individual members of the society, understand the results of the AI is fair in that particular context, and they are dependable and they can be consistent. And Jack, as you mentioned, the risks and the harms and the benefits are more or less equitably shared, then I think that's where the trust is going to come. To your first question about what the industry leaders could do, I think action rather than talks. I flash back, so my background is from financial sector. I used to be in financial sector for a very long time. And then I go back to this 2008 Wall Street and economic crisis times, and there's a researcher called Sorosky, and he lamented a couple of decades ago saying Wall Street doesn't have to keep confessing its sins, it just has to stop committing them. I think we can draw a parallel to big tech companies who have societal responsibilities to prevent these harms, to act more responsibly and stop deploying systems just because they can, but maybe prioritize societal well-being and ahead of commercial interests.
So I will add with a cautionary note, but then make a couple more constructive comments. The cautionary note is, as an observer of cybersecurity for decades, a lot of the problems that were discussed in the 80s and 90s persist today. And there's just a very long history of companies privileging functionality, features, shipping a product to meet a deadline, to satisfy investors, and so on, and getting away with it. The patch and release, patch, fix, update, whatever, that we might come up with new ways, new arguments that say with Gen AI, that's particularly bad because, but until we can articulate that in a meaningful way that does generate consequences or action, then there is a part of me that worries we'll see this kind of cycle repeat, just as we've seen with the early applications of ChatGPT or GPT, whatever, and some of the other systems. But on a more positive basis, in those industries where safety really matters, there is a known tradition of safety culture. And there might be a general version of responsibility culture, but safety culture involves being proactive. It has to be baked into the training and the reward system of the talent who develop the systems. That would help militate against compliance culture and ethics washing and all the way of gaming the system. It has to be sincere, it has to come from the top down, and whistleblowers from the bottom up have to be accommodated and rewarded. There are examples of this with applications of other kinds of AI. The question is whether this can actually happen with Gen AI. The other observation I would make is that there are opportunities for collective action when you're talking about industry leaders or other people in industry. So some of that might involve setting of standards, setting of best practices, establishing norms, getting people in companies broadly to talk about what is acceptable. When it comes to the critical infrastructure arena, we have the ISACs, which involve information sharing, and this harks back to our earlier discussion about incidents. But again, there could be collective action vehicles that might involve some interaction with government or not, that fosters constructive exchange aimed at avoiding problems. So I think that there are ways to move forward that engage leaders responsibly, even outside of a context where an industry might be regulated and its leaders channeled. And then finally, I'd note that there are other actors that have an influence on industry leaders, insurers, audit functions, corporate boards, and so on. So you have to look at the entire ecosystem and not just the executives of the companies producing the core systems.
So we have just 2 minutes left in our time. It's really flown by. Thank you both for giving us so much to think about. I'd like to remind everybody that we have the next session of this coming up very soon, and we hope to see you all there for a look under the hood. And with that, I'd like to thank Marjory and Merve. I guess we have just a minute or so if you want to get in a last word, either of you, about something that you didn't get a chance to say.
I've enjoyed having this conversation with Merve. I knew that we would come at these issues from a somewhat different point of view. I am overall both an optimist and a pessimist at the same time. And we do live in interesting times when it comes to Gen AI.
Absolutely. And thank you for the invitation, Jack, and for the opportunity to discuss this with Marjory as well. I really appreciate this coast-to-coast seminars of 6 universities coming together to discuss this. I would definitely love to see further discussions and collaborations on what this means for research and possibly how to imagine new features of what research should look like or what researchers need and what an ideal space conditions for researchers would be for when dealing with generative AI systems. So thank you for all of the universities and your team as well for organizing.
So thank you both again, and thank you everybody. I'm H.B. Jagadish, Director of the Michigan Institute of Data Science at the University of Michigan, signing off. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.